Infor Track shift setup. Shifts are used in Time Track to control the attendance rules which employees are supposed to adhere to. Use this form to define different sets of clock-in rules, define the start day of the shift week, define the number of work days versus non-work days in the shift week, start and end time of each shift day in the week, the overtime method, the labor type to post hours to, and the number of authorized hours per shift day. In order to open the shift form, select the shift icon from the administrator homepage. To create a new shift, select the new icon from the icon ribbon. The shift configuration consists of 5 components: the header, the labor type definitions, the core time definitions, the authorized hours setup, and auto clock out configuration. The shift header setup starts by defining the shift code and description. Enter the shift code in the shift field and the description in the adjacent field. Setting the active checkbox to yes allows employees to enter hours on the shift. Logical midnight is used for shifts that may have hours on 2 separate calendar days. Tells the application when to stop one report date and move on to the next report date. Set the logical midnight at a time when employees assigned to the shift are least likely to be clocked in. A good rule of thumb is to set the logical midnight 12 hours from the midpoint between the shift's start time and end time. Report date adjustment is used to place transaction times onto the proper report date. When report date adjustment is set to next day, a labor transaction that begins on one day and ends on the next will be counted towards the report date corresponding with the transaction stop. When report date adjustment is set to previous day, a labor transaction beginning one day and ending on the next will be counted towards the report date corresponding with the transaction start. The shift type specifies whether hours will be categorized for overtime based on the number of hours entered or based on the time of day the hours are booked for. A dynamic shift starts the count regardless of when the hours are entered. A static shift will determine the characterization based on the time of day the hours are entered for. There are 4 overtime calculation methods. These are daily, daily and weekly, weekly, and California. The daily overtime method in a dynamic shift sets an overtime threshold and double time threshold based on the number of hours worked in the day. For example, a shift that authorizes 8 hours of regular hours in the day plus 4 hours of overtime beyond that will categorize 10 clocked hours in the day as 8 hours regular and 2 hours overtime. The daily overtime method in a static shift sets a duration of time prior to the start of the shift as overtime before shift, and a duration of time prior to the start of overtime before the shift as double time before shift. Same is done for durations after the end of the shift to define the overtime and double time timeframes. For example, a shift that has a start time of 0600 and end time of 1400, with 2 hours overtime before the shift, 1 hour of double time before the overtime before the shift, 2 hours of overtime after the shift with 1 hour of double time after the overtime, will categorize 10 clocked hours starting at 0300 and ending at 1300 as 1 hour of double time before, 2 hours as overtime before, and 7 hours regular. On the same shift, a clock in at 0500 and out at 1500 will categorize as 1 hour of overtime before, 8 hours regular, and 1 hour of overtime. Similarly, a clock in at 0600 and out at 1600 would categorize as 8 hours regular and 2 hours of overtime. The daily overtime method works well with both dynamic and static shift types. Daily and weekly works the same as the daily overtime method, except this method includes a complete week component. When the overtime calculation method is set to daily and weekly, the overtime threshold and double time threshold fields activate. You enter the total number of regular hours that need to be worked in order for the week to be considered a complete week. The field format is hours and minutes, so 4000 means 40 hours. The double time threshold field activates but is not used for this overtime method, so it may be left blank. On the shift authorized hours, configure the daily overtime and double time thresholds that should be applied on non-working days when a complete week is met. On the employee type punch parameters tab, specify the daily overtime and double time thresholds that should be applied on non-working days when a complete week is not met. The concept is that the thresholds for authorized hours are lower in the shift configuration than they are in the employee type configuration, thereby rewarding the employee that works a complete week. Daily and weekly works with both dynamic and static shift types. The weekly overtime method starts accumulating hours at the beginning of the shift week. When the overtime calculation method is set to weekly, the overtime threshold and double time threshold fields activate. Again, the entries are in hours and minutes, so 4,000 means 40 hours and 6,000 means 60 hours. Assuming the overtime threshold is set to 40 hours, all hours prior to 40 will be categorized as regular hours. Any hours in excess of 40 will categorize as overtime up to the double time threshold. Assuming the double time threshold is set to 60 hours, any hours in excess of 60 hours in the week will categorize as double time. The weekly overtime method works well with dynamic shift types, but is not recommended for static shift types. The final method is the California overtime method. This is designed to give the employee the better of the daily overtime method or weekly overtime method. When the overtime calculation method is set to California, the overtime threshold and double time threshold fields activate. In the overtime threshold, enter the total number of regular hours that need to be worked in order for the week to be considered a complete week. In this case, 4,000 refers to 40 hours. The double time threshold field activates but is used for the 7th day feature supported by the California method. It does not act as a weekly double time threshold. It specifies the daily double time threshold when the employee meets the 7th day criteria. The 7th day criteria is a feature that rewards the employee with no overtime threshold and a lower double time threshold when the employee works 7 consecutive days. In the 7th day field, select the measurement period. This tells the application the criteria for 7 consecutive days worked. The shift week indicates all 7 days of the shift week have been worked. A Monday to Sunday shift week with hours on each day, Monday to Saturday, would consider Sunday as the 7th consecutive day. The next options are Monday to Sunday or Sunday to Saturday. If we use these days as 7-day criteria, then these work irrespective of the shift week. Or we can use rolling 7, which considers any 7th day of consecutive work eligible for the 7th day threshold, or none, which suspends the feature and treats the 7th the same as any other day in the week. By default, only regular hours count towards the weekly threshold. We can set include all worked hours to overtime threshold to yes to count all clocked hours towards the weekly overtime threshold. By default, absence hours will count towards daily and weekly thresholds based on their overtime eligibility setting in the absences configuration. We can set non-OTE hours to weekly threshold to yes to omit non-OTE absence hours from daily overtime threshold, but include them in the count towards the weekly overtime threshold. Include all worked hours to overtime threshold may be restricted to the authorized hours for the day by setting count daily authorized only to yes. When this is set to yes, the count towards the weekly overtime threshold will be limited to the number of regular plus overtime plus double time hours authorized for the day. The California method works best with the dynamic shift type. Next, we look at the labor type configurations. Here we specify the labor type code used for the underlying ERP to identify the hours type. Some ERP labor types are hard-coded. In these instances, just enter those hard-coded values in the time track shift form, for example, R, O, and D. Other ERPs have labor types that are configurable. In these instances, enter the labor type code you want hours from a particular shift to post as in the ERP. Dynamic shift types only require definition of regular overtime and double time. Static shifts also require definition of overtime before shift and double time before shift. Labor type definition is not mutually exclusive, depending on how your cost model is set up in the underlying ERP. You can use the same labor type for each hour's categorization, use the same labor type for before shift and after shift categorization, use the same labor type for overtime and double time categorizations, or use a unique set of labor types for each hour's categorization. The only requirement is that the labor type code you specify exists as a labor type code in the underlying ERP. Next, we look at the core times configuration. This is the basic definition of the schedule. First, we set the shift week start date. We select the first day and the rest of the week will default in sequentially. The day selected as the first day of the shift week will be used as the starting point in counts towards weekly overtime thresholds. Next, we set the start and end times for each shift day. The values entered will be the basis for determining whether clock in is early, late, or on time. Set the end time based on how much unpaid time is planned during the day. If you expect the employee to work 8 hours on a shift day and take a 30-minute unpaid lunch, set the start date to 6 a.m. and the end time to 2:30 p.m. If the employee punches per the schedule, they'll clock in at 6 a.m., clock out and in for a 30-minute lunch, then clock out at 2:30, so the total clocked hours would be 8. Time track utilities that generate all-day absences use the span of time between the start and end time, less reductions that are configured to exclude absence hours. Assuming the clock reduction is configured to exclude absence, the absence creation utilities would determine the span between the start and end time is 8.5 hours, less the 30-minute reduction. Using this, the utility would create an 8-hour absence on the shift when asked to create an all-day absence. Work codes tell the application how to handle hours. When overtime eligible is selected, the overtime method specified for the shift will be applied to the hours. When the overtime method is to be overridden with a specific hours type, set the work code to that hours type. The alternatives are regular, overtime, and double time. All hours entered on a shift day with a work code override will categorize as that hours type. The day type defines the shift day as a working day, non-working day, or clock-in not allowed. Clock-in rules are enforced on working days. For overtime methods containing a complete week component, the regular hours entered on a working day go into the count towards a complete week. Absence hours may only be entered on working days. Clock-in rules are suspended on non-working days, and absence hours may not be entered on non-working days. Shift days that are set to do not allow clock-in will hard stop employees attempting to clock in on that shift day. Reduction sets are schedules for lunch and break times that are created on the reduction set form. Select a reduction set from the pull-down. The same reduction set may be used for each shift day, but there are many other acceptable combinations as well. We can leave the field blank if there are no reductions for a shift, specify a reduction for some days and leaving others blank, or specify different reduction sets for different days. Next, we set the Authorized Hours tab. The settings depend on what type of shifts we're talking about. For daily and weekly, and California overtime methods, using a dynamic shift type, the numbers in the hours fields represent the daily overtime thresholds. So 800 in the hours field of the regular section means the first 8 hours on the shift day will categorize as regular time. Anything in excess of 8 hours will characterize as overtime or double time. 200 in the overtime section means that for the first 2 hours after the overtime threshold, the hours will categorize as overtime. 100 in the double time section means that for the first hour after the double time threshold is met, the hours will categorize as double time. Anything in excess of that will still categorize as double time, but an exception will be generated for the hours. The purpose of the exception is to call to the supervisor's attention that the employee has worked longer than has been authorized for the shift day. Hours cannot be processed until all exceptions are either resolved or authorized. For daily and weekly, and California overtime methods using a static shift type, the numbers in the hours fields represent the offset from the scheduled start and end times that define the daily overtime thresholds. 830 in the hours fields of the regular section represents the duration between the scheduled start time and end time. With this shift type, the value entered here has no real role. Hours that occurred between the scheduled start and end time are the sole factor that results in their categorization as regular time. 200 in the overtime section means that the first 2 hours after the scheduled end time will categorize as overtime. With a 2:30 p.m. end time, hours booked between 2:30 and 4:30 will categorize as overtime, regardless of how many hours were worked earlier in the day. 100 in the double time section means that for the first hour after the double time threshold, the hours will categorize as double time. Anything in excess of that will still categorize as double time, but an exception will be generated. With static shift types, the overtime before shift and double time before shift sections activate. They work in the same manner as the authorized for overtime and double time, except they represent offsets from the scheduled start time of the day. The weekly overtime method does not have a daily component, but the daily authorized hours can be used to set a maximum number of hours per day that may be worked without generating an exception. The maximum allowed hours per day is derived by summing the authorized hours for each day. When regular hours are authorized for 8 hours, overtime for 2, and double time for 1, the maximum allowed hours would be 11 hours. Employees booking less than or equal to 11 hours would not generate an exception. Anything over 11 hours would generate an exception. There is a parameter on the Employee Type Punch Parameters tab labeled Authorized Overtime Required. You set this parameter to yes to restrict the allowed hours per day to the number of regular hours authorized for the day. Auto Clockout is activated by selecting a time of day to invoke the automatic clockout. The options are none, at midnight, at logical midnight, or after shift. You select one, then hit the Submit button. This will create an active background task that will invoke Auto Clockout at the time of day selected. The active background task number is displayed in the task number field. If at midnight is selected, each day at midnight the application will search for open report dates. These are report dates that have clock-ins but do not have clock-outs. Any that it finds, it will create a clock-out for using the shift end time as the transaction time of the clock-out. If the auto clockout fails, the report date will remain in a non-ready status and the supervisor will need to address the issue manually. If at logical midnight is selected, it works the same way as at midnight, except the auto clockout is invoked at the logical midnight of the shift. To change your auto clockout setting, select Clear. This deletes the active background task and clears the task number field. After shift is the third option for invoking auto clockout. With this selection, auto clockout is invoked at a specified amount of time after the shift end time. When after shift is selected, the hours after shift field is activated. If we enter 400 there, this means it will run 4 hours after the shift is due to end. So for a shift ending at 2:30 p.m. and auto clockout set for 4 hours, the job will be generated to run at 6:30 p.m. When all the aspects of the shift have been entered, hit Save to commit your selections. Any changes made to a shift configuration will become effective the next time the employee clocks in. Changes may be made retroactively after an employee is clocked out by performing a temporary shift change for that report date.